I'm Jane Kader, and I'm the great-granddaughter of Sheikh Abdul El-Qadir, who came to Australia in the late part of the 19th century and was very involved as a cameleer and many, many other things in his life. So, unfortunately, I never met my great-grandfather, but I knew my grandfather well, his only surviving son, although he did have another son who died young, sadly. My great-grandfather was born into a Parsi family, and there's some conjecture about the date of birth, possibly 1879, but it may have been earlier. And he was born in Karachi, in modern-day Pakistan, which was India, I believe, at the time. And his Christian name was Umar Dadaboy Sukhia. And his family was Zoroastrians, Parsi. And his father also had the name Dadaboy Edilji Sukhia. And his mother was Shirinbar. And I'm not aware of any other children that they had, but they might have had other children. And he came to to Western Australia from India in 1895, and he was only 16. It tells me here, but he could have been older. And he did move back and forth between India and other parts of the world during his time in Australia. He wasn't always in the one place. He met and married a woman called Sybil Rose Marsh, whose family would have been of English extraction originally. Her father was a civil engineer, and they married in 1907 in Perth, Western Australia, and they had two sons. One of them was my grandfather, the younger son, Leonard Nadir Kader. I'm saying Kader because that's the modern anglicised version of it. He was born in 1911. He had an older brother, Rustam, who was born in 1909, and the story in the family is that he died as when he was 11 or 12, 13 perhaps, when on one of his many trips to India, he drowned in the Ganges, leaving my grandfather the only surviving son. And so the descendants here in Australia are all through my grandfather, who had 3 natural children and 1 adopted child. And then their descendants are the descendants of Sheikh Abdul El-Qadir. So my grandfather was apparently a well-known figure around the goldfields area in Victoria, around Perth. He was also up in the desert areas with his camels. He used to wear his beautiful turban and robe, so he was quite a dashing figure. People remembered him. I think he rode a horse around, although of course he was good with camels as well. And people remembered him in Bendigo and Ballarat and into the Oodnadatta, all around that area. He used to travel around. He also used to bring in goods from India and other places, and he brought in luxury goods for people. So carpets, basketry, beautiful shawls and scarves and that sort of thing, and homewares, I think. And then he would bring them by camel train to different places. He also did a lot for the people on the big stations up north, Beltana and so on. He used to, I think, collect goods and bring them in he had a bit to do with the stations. He had a lot to do also with the mosques and setting up the mosques. There was one at Hergot Springs, at Marree, and there he planted, was it one of the first date plantations? I'm not sure if it still exists. It does still exist. So these are just stories that have come down through my family. There's sort of little dribs and drabs and much that we don't know. But Pamela Radowski knows quite a lot. She's done a lot of research. So from what I can gather, my grandfather did much to help his fellow immigrants from India and Afghanistan. And one of the things that he did was help with the mosque at Herget Springs. And he was aware that his fellows, cameleers, required a place where they could replenish where there was water, both for practical and spiritual reasons. They required the water to immerse themselves in the water, and also they required nourishment, and so he planted the date plantation there. He also, in order to get the water to this mosque, which I believe was a mud brick building, I read a bit about it, and they needed to bring a pipe from the town to get the water there, and in that way he was helping his fellow immigrants and cameleers. And the dates had a spiritual significance as well, because they were used at the end of Ramadan to break the fast, and also carried on. They kept well, of course. So they would have carried them on the camels because they were already sort of dried out, and they would be useful sustenance along the journey. Yes, because it would have been a very, very difficult life for the cameleers. They traversed huge areas of land, and from what I could gather yesterday, the various descendants talking about the lives of their grandfathers and great-grandfathers, they often walked the camels because the camels carried so many goods that it was valuable space that they would have taken up if they were actually on top of the camel. So a lot of this ground was walked, and the desert's extremely harsh and dry, and it's amazing many of them survived, actually. So family law says that he belonged to a group of traders, and in his early years before he came to Australia. And they travelled up through Afghanistan and into Tibet, and they bought these luxury goods that I mentioned. And so when he came to Australia, he had a business bringing in these things. And he also had a number of shops, apparently, in different places, where he did quite well, catered the trader, as we say in our family. And he became well known selling some of these goods. Also in the family there's a story that the reason he stopped doing this at some point, I don't know the date, was that the Australian government put an embargo on goods that were coming into the country, foreign goods at some point. And that sort of forced him into probably receivership, or he could no longer continue to do that sort of business in a profitable way. But he obviously went on to do many, many other interesting things, and he was a linguist and an interpreter. And he built on these skills, and he worked with the courts. I believed he worked in Sydney and Melbourne, Adelaide. And his main motivation was to help his fellow immigrants from India and Afghanistan, and he was an advocate for many of them. A number of them that came here were not only illiterate in English, which is understandable, but in their own tongue. Some of them couldn't read or write in their own tongue, and so he was a mouthpiece for them to help them, particularly in court cases and so on. And there were many of these, and I have several examples of them here. There's one letter here. Oh, I should point out, here is my great-grandfather, Sheikh Abdul El-Qadir, and with his oldest son, Rustam, who died in the Ganges, and his youngest son, Leonard Nadir. Nadir was the second name, who was my grandfather, who I remember very fondly, who died many years ago now in his 60s, but I have strong memories of him and spending time with him. as did all the family. And this must have been taken, I think, in India. The marriage failed at some point, his marriage to Sybil Marsh, and we're not sure when, possibly after the death of the eldest son. Perhaps that was traumatic and then they split up, or she took off, I'm not sure. But he did take the boys back and forth to India in these days. And so my grandfather, his early sort of memories and that were of India. And I just want to mention my grandfather briefly because he was a very talented and amazing man. And he never had much in his life in Australia. He did open the first cafe in close to the Central Market in Adelaide, what we would have called a greasy fish cafe, where they would have done meat and 3 veg or fish and chips. And that was before the Second World War. And in those days, there weren't a lot of cafes in Adelaide. And they would have made a pittance in the little cafe, and the family all worked hard in it. But he was a man that also had a very rich interior life. So he wrote wonderful poems inspired by his early years in India. But what the catalyst for those poems was that he signed up voluntarily to go to the East during World War II, and he was one of the famous Rats of Tobruk, which are famed in Australia for their fighting prowess in World War II. And he was ribbed by his fellow soldiers because he looked like the enemy. He looked like the Turkish men that they were fighting. So he good-naturedly used to, they used to laugh about it because they were fighting the Turkish people and he looked like them. But during that time, he saw absolute untold horrors and just all the awful things of war, and that's what inspired a whole series of poems that he wrote, and in the style of Omar Khayyam, the famous poet, and they're called The Wanderings of Nadir Shah. And if we have some time at the end of this chat, I will read a small part of one because they link into Desert Voices Speak, which is the title of this event for History Month 225, because they're very much inspired by the culture and the spiritual beliefs of the people of India and Afghanistan, and also the visual inspiration of the desert, and also about the futility of life in a way, the sort of sadness and poignancy about them, because he was surrounded by war, of the young men dying needlessly, and it comes through in the poems, which are well worth a read. So I just wanted to show people, here's my grandfather Leonard, who called himself Nadir Shah, it's his second name, when he wrote the poems, his Indian name. But when he came back from the war, he worked in the South Australia Hotel, which was a very iconic building in Adelaide, which sadly was destroyed in the 1970s, bulldozed. It was opposite the railway station, an enormous old hotel. It's also known for where the Beatles, when they came to South Australia. And here's Leonard in the war years. I'll just put my finger on when he was one of the Rats of Tobruk. There he is with his fellow soldiers. And some more. I'll put my finger on which one he is in the photographs taken.
Just hold those ones for a bit longer.
Okay. This one says, on a bender, he liked to drink. On a bender in Jerusalem, yours truly. So I think when they weren't fighting, they headed for the alcohol. Here's an original printed, would have been on an old typewriter, of one of his poems that he would have typed up. And one of his poems appeared in this magazine, Quo Vadis, in 1971. And here he is a little later in life. In the middle, and his son, my father, Dennis Cater, wonderful man and an adventurer, my father. You can see very much the Indian details in his face. Very handsome man. So it was my father. So getting back to the Sheikh, who was my grandfather, this is my great-grandfather. He championed his people, and he in this letter written to the Collector of Customs in Port Adelaide in 1923, he is championing a Mr. Khan, and it's to do with him coming in to the country. And I mean, it's quite complicated, but you can see it's signed there, Sheikh Abdul Qadir, 1923. And he must have had a lot to do with the big business people around Adelaide. Here is a little typed letter from Mr. Penfold Highland, who would have had owned the winery, the famous winery here in South Australia, the Penfolds. And it says, I have to offer you 1,000, dear Sheikh. It was often called just Sheikh. And this is in 1931. I have to offer you 1,000 thanks for your very kind thoughts at Christmas time. I thought you'd only gone to Melbourne for a short while and would be returning here, otherwise I'd have written before. I was talking to Mr. Fisher the other day, and he asked to be very kindly remembered to you. Will you let me know when you are coming over? I would like you to come along and have a look over our winery. Yeah. So at that time, Sheikh Abdul Qadir's address was in Carlton, Victoria, but as I said, he also lived in Sydney. This one was obviously Melbourne and in Adelaide, and had a lot to do with the court. So he built on his abilities as a linguist and interpreter, and helped a huge number of people, I believe, and had a lot to do with the mosque in Adelaide as well. And I guess some of the people that he was helping would have come via the mosque. Yes, and yes. I'm just going to show some of the photographs of the Sheikh. There he is there. I'm not sure where this was taken. And here he is, hamming it up with a knife in his mouth. So he must have been a bit of a character, I think. He's got the knife and the turban. And he looks like he's about to attack somebody there in a joking sort of way. And here he is again. And he was frequently in the paper. Here we have Sheikh Abdul Qadir. And in this one, you can see he's a very dapper man, dressed beautifully. In this one, is just some of it's missing, but it says that he had been over in Arabia and the Jedi government had put him in a dungeon for 11 days. So he did have an interesting life. Obviously, he got out. He was frequently in the paper. This is from 1939. He wrote into the paper quite a bit, and somebody's responding to him there. It's quite complicated. I won't read it all, but... and an interesting thing is that he used to take my grandfather, Leonard, to the mosque in Adelaide, and when he was young. And he had a lot to do with the mosque, and he, in order for the cameleers and the Afghan people to be buried in a special area of West Terrace Cemetery in Adelaide here, he paid for that area, that plot of land, so that his fellow countrymen could be buried in that area. Most of them were men, I believe, that came out here. Well, probably all of them, really, yeah. I did want to just read this interesting article, a little bit tongue-in-cheek, probably from the, I'm not sure, but more than likely from the Advertiser. But it's a bit hard to know. It possibly 1920s or early 30s. Remember, this is the days of the silent films, that people flocked to see the silent films, and a very famous one was called The Sheikh, and Rudolph Valentino was the actor. So when it talks about filmdom, that's what it's talking about here. So it's headed, District Court, Afghans, insurance policy, house burnt down, company denies liability. A tall, majestic Afghan with head turbaned, booming out, I am Sheikh Abdul Qadir, caused somewhat of a stir in the district court yesterday and was reminiscent of the Sheikh's filmdom. The Afghan, with arms folded, solemnity personified, acted as an interpreter in a case in which Juma Khan proceeded against the Bankers and Traders Insurance Company to recover £350 allegedly due on his house. In his opening address, Mr. Newell pointed out that a man who was illiterate and a foreigner was forced to rely on the agent of the insurance company. This was the case with Gemma Khan. With stern sincerity, Sheikh Abdul Qadir stepped up to the witness box and, seeing the green-clothed Bible in his hand, pressed it to his forehead and cheeks. Judge Bevan caused some amusement by remarking that all the Afghans seemed to take the oath differently. The number of kisses and where the book was placed varied considerably. He supposed it was all right. Captain Storkey protested against an interpreter being used in vain. The Afghan, Sheikh Abdul Qadir, said he lived in Adelaide and had been throughout the Commonwealth in his capacity as an interpreter. He spoke fluent English of the learned, not the sheikh type. And when Mr. Newell asked him when Khan, in inverted commas, turned up to the insurance office, Mr. Qadir's face was a blank until the word arrive was substituted. He knew not Australian slang. I haven't got the rest of the article, but it's quite amusing. And the attitudes of the time. So, really in the major part of Sheikh Abdul's working life, he was involved in the courts and as I said, championing his fellow countrymen, and he was involved, very well known in Sydney and Melbourne courts, and helped in the Adelaide courts as well. And he was invited over to Melbourne to speak. A Rotary Club, and it was there that he sadly died while he was there in 1941, I think it is, 1941. It says here he died in Heidelberg, Victoria. But I believe, and he did live in Melbourne at different times, there's addresses for him there. And Gunbow was one of the places which you can see on this wonderful old envelope. And this has come from Baghdad. This is postmarked Baghdad on the back, this envelope. Yes, in family stories suggest that he went to Mecca 3 times. And of course he had the name, so he converted to Muslim, a Muslim religion, Mohammedism, at some point in his life. I'm not sure entirely when. But so he did go to Mecca, and I believe you had to be quite wealthy to go to Mecca, quite comfortably off to go back and forth to Mecca that number of times in that period of history. And he also is purported to have met Gandhi in his life as well, which is an interesting point. So, yes, sadly I never met him, and I'm sure there's much, much more to discover about his life that would probably be written in newspapers and so on. But I would like to end by reading just a small part of this poem by his son, my grandfather Leonard Cater, that he wrote during the war. As I said, these poems were given to Dr. Derek Whitelock via the University of Adelaide Staff Club, I think in about 1960s, about around that time. But they were written during the Second World War, so that would have been in the early 40s. So this particular poem is called, I think it's The Call of the Muezzin, and it's only the last part of it. I'll be here all day. Right. But alas, on awakening, is it not true, we too seek in our age, like the bygone, a better and higher peak? Is this too not an illusion, reflecting on a mirrored lake, someday to be shattered for some other godly sake? Is this too not like a tent that will someday be struck and gone, and the star which lights our highway wilt and fade with the coming dawn? Am I but to follow the destiny of an age, and like a sheep to slaughter the preaching of its sage? And there be a haven, will its shore be ever reached? Will the dumb gods break their silence and tell us when it preached? Will they in their hatred of death to us avail, or still claim the soul for our spirits to prevail? Myriad are the questions from many eager minds, but as myriad are the deities and as many are their shrines. I bow my head in sorrow, my brow betwixt my hands, sadly disillusioned by reflection on the sands. Cowards may go cringing to perpetuate the brave, but all roads belong to Nemesis, to a haven in a grave. So that's very poignant to me, because it reminds me of my father and my grandfather and my wonderful great-grandfather. So my great-grandfather, the Sheikh, he was well known in many places and around Adelaide, dressed in his turban and his robes. And he was great friends with the herbalist and healer, Muhammad Alam, that is quite a famous name in Adelaide. And in Wright Street, he had his rooms, and where he used to help people with all sorts of terrible, life-threatening problems. And so he was great friends with my grandfather. Two of the men would have had very interesting conversations if you could have gone back in time and eavesdropped on what they were talking about. But he was also great, because he lived to a good age, he was also great friends with my grandfather, the Sheikh's son, Leonard, who had the cafe very close to the market, behind the market, and the old building is still there. And then I remember my father meeting Muhammad Alam and talking about how he healed people. And interestingly enough, he often healed people by getting them to fast, and he would just get them to take some dates. So that's an interesting sort of link with the date plantation and the healing power of dates. And he healed a number of people who had gone through the usual channels and couldn't resolve their health issues. So he was very highly thought of, and all sorts of people went to Muhammad Alam. So Muhammad Alam, being an alternate healer, was often singled out by the police, and he had to go to court several times and faced with charges. I guess they didn't like that he wasn't doing mainstream medicine. And he and my great-grandfather, they would have helped each other, and because Sheikh Abdul El-Qadir helped many people in the courts, they would have had interesting discussions and possibly helped each other with various court cases during those times.